Welcome, everyone. The video you are about to watch was originally recorded with Andrew Sweeny and Christopher Mastropietro on Andrew's channel, the Parallax. And this is very important. This is very appreciative of this. This is a very significant discussion about the philosophical Silk Road and really unpacking what that means. I hope you enjoy this video.
Perhaps the Silk Road and pilgrimage can be our jumping off point in terms of a subject. Is that okay with you guys?
Very happy to talk about that. Very happy to talk about that.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps
So I was thinking of like the
go ahead.
inner Silk Road. Sorry, one more
Yeah.
little
Sure.
the inner Silk Road in terms of the journeys we all take with books and etc. And then you're actually going on a journey, so
Yeah.
and a real pilgrimage. So I'd like to hear you talk about that.
Yeah. So, well, maybe I'll talk about that pivot from the religion that's not a religion into the pilgrimage or the philosophical Silk Road and what that means. So one of the reasons for it was, in the proper sense, not in any kind of manipulative sense, rhetorical. The religion that was not a religion was just pissing everybody off on all sides, and therefore it was bothering the religious people, and it was bothering the non-religious people, and people would sort of grudgingly admit that they got my point, but they still didn't like it, and there was an affective resistance that was just not landing. And then also for me, I have moved more and more away uh, from, I don't know what to call it, the atheistic pole on the religious spectrum, if there is such a thing. And I'm more and more into a much more vibrant and vital non-theism. The sacred is speaking to me. Sorry, that sounds really pretentious. I'm experiencing it as the sacred speaking to me more, and that the more and more people I'm talking to, and I mean high caliber, high quality people in this whole arena, like when I was talking to Emil Gilchrist and Daniel Schmachtenberger, the advent of the sacred as a response to the meaning crisis is a growing theme. And I have found myself more and more called into service to doing whatever I can to afford the advent of that sacred in as many people as possible. And so a third thing happened. I was in Etna last year
Oh,
with Bishop
I've been there.
Maximus.
Yeah, Edna.
Yeah. And he said to me, and he's a dear friend, tremendous respect for my work, but all obviously a profound commitment to Eastern Orthodox Christianity. And I leave it to him and how he manages that wonderful friendship and that deep allegiance. It seems to work for him. It certainly works for me. So I'm grateful for that. But he said, John, I don't like this religion that's not a religion. I really like the philosophical Silk Road you've been talking about. And I thought, yeah, there's something there. There's something there. And I realized that the advent of the sacred is not exclusive to the nuns, the NONES. It's also inclusive of people who are in the legacy religions and are homed therein. And then I thought, well, I want to do something that extends the courtyard of Dialogos, so that people can walk between the various homes. Nobody lives on the Silk Road. People move along it. C.S. Lewis has a very similar notion. Paul Van der Klee told me this when his book Mere Christianity. He calls it hallway Christianity. It's the Christianity that lets people move through the various rooms, the denominations that people live in. But nobody lives in the hallway. But man, if you don't have a hallway in your house, you're doomed. You're trapped. You're imprisoned. And so the Silk Road is meant to be that kind of much more global hallway, extended courtyard in which people can find a shared uh, philosophical framework, language that allows them to travel in case they need to leave where they are and find another home, or travel, they have no home and find one, or travel and then return to their home, like the anthropologist returning from another culture, and recover their home deeply. It's T.S. Eliot, seeing it again for the first time. And it has been now my understanding that that is a more full-bodied and appropriate response to the advent of the sacred. And I should not be pronouncing on how these legacy religions may or may not comport themselves to the affordance and the participation in this. I will make what I can available to them, and it, of course, up to their agency and their choice how they will respond. And this, of course, is also still directed, as everything on my work always is towards the nuns. The effect that this has had on me is it became it became very prominently clear to me that I could not do this as I'd done any of the other courses. This could not be a merely intellectual, philosophical, or even the teaching of practices like in After Socrates, that this had to be something that I shared by undergoing a pilgrimage to various places on the Silk Road and engaging with various of the sages, both sages that'll come along for me along the way and various sages that will represent various homes that I will visit and dwell within. And then when I made that decision, it was like a switch was flipped deep in my chest, deep in my psyche. I've been on a personal process of, again, I don't want to build too much into this, but I don't have a better word. There's been something like a purification process I've been going through, a preparation process, a deeply personal spiritual transformation to make myself proper to the pilgrimage. And so that is what is happening. I'll say just a few more things, and I'll let Chris speak. And then when I proposed this to my wonderful, I don't like to call them my staff, I don't know who, the group at the Vervaeke Foundation that support my work and carry out the foundation, there was an immense reception to this. Chris was particularly and has been continuously deeply enthusiastic. He, of course, is very concerned with the philosophical and the spiritual, but the opportunity to also bring in the drama, animation, music, the geophilosophy, the aesthetics as a way of carrying the message. We can talk a little bit more about the format, but the way that he and others, especially Chris, though, have taken this up and it has really called to them, has enriched and encouraged me. So that's my initial response as to what the philosophical Silk Road is.
Can I make one comment before I pass it over to Chris?
Yes.
I was thinking about, as you were speaking, I'm not a nun. I became a real Buddhist at a certain point in my 20s. And in Buddhism, you take refuge. And when you take refuge, you make a vow to be, it's a strange thing. You make a vow to be homeless, which is kind of strange because in a way, the meaning crisis that you speak of is about kind of finding home. But in another sense, there's an embrace of homelessness. So I was thinking about the dialectic between being, home and homelessness in the world. So anyway, Chris, what about, you want to respond and tell me a bit about your pilgrimage or your travels?
Well, I could take that up, actually, what you just said. I like that. Yeah, there's something to me about religiousness that is implicitly homeless in a sense of culture. But I think the kind of home we mean, I'm curious to see what you say about this, John, because I sometimes think we have similar ideas about this, and sometimes I think we have different ideas about this, but I think there is a healthy dialectic between them, the idea of having religious home. And the thing that I find healthy and compelling about the idea of the Silk Road and the way that John's envisioning it, especially for this series and in general, is that the idea that there is a kind of implicit religious or symbolic grammar that is sort of native to each of us. And that doesn't mean that that's immutable and can't be influenced and changed across time, but there is a kind of a way in which we have a particular disposition and a particular psychic life that commends us to a certain way of being religious, which is a certain way of encountering the sacred. We don't all encounter the sacred in exactly the same way, and we each have a different road that we need to take to get there. And that particular road that is individual to us, idiosyncratically, I think is much more the home that I understand the religious life to be, which is to say, it's something within us.
So the road is the
And it can
home.
be,
The path is the
well,
home.
I think so, yeah, and I think in some sense, yeah, there is. I think that's true. I think the road is the home. There's a way in which there is a way. I mean, the religious motifs and the motifs of the religious journey always involve, almost invariably, the renunciation of home in the sense of the protective, enculturated sense of home, and the departure from that seems to be essential to that motif, essential to that pattern. And so the homelessness of religion is, I think, something very important. But I mean, I guess this is a very Stoic idea in addition to whatever other kind of idea it is. But the idea of the Silk Road to me is that the wandering and the traveling and the encountering different influences and the metabolizing of a lingua philosophica helps to create a space within oneself into which that inward process can pour itself, discover itself, and metabolize itself, right? Sometimes, the more I engage with this work, the more I realize that so much of the dawning consciousness of our encounter with the sacred is ultimately a process that happens to us. It occurs to us. We can bring consciousness to bear on it and augment it and make space for it and inquire within it in such a way as to invite it. Right. So I do believe that consciousness and the training and the honing that comes with the Socratic way and all of the attendant practices have a very, very powerful role in sensitizing us to it, in drawing it out and inviting it, right? The whole idea of the dialectic as being the inquiry that makes space for that which is unconscious and upswells into our awareness, as opposed to something that we contrive or create from the top down, which incidentally was the overtone to the religion that is not a religion that I think was the thing about it that didn't work. It implied design principles.
Yeah.
It implied a top-down over-determination of something that is fundamentally an upswell and can be tutored and honed and trained and finessed and disciplined by Socratic inquiry, and necessarily so, but is ultimately something that is endogenous within the person that has to be discovered, and that we can bring all kinds of techniques to tutor it, but that we have to let it be what it is. And all of these techniques and journeys and adventures and philosophical language, I think really at its best, serves to make space for a process that happens to us and that we have to simply receive. And there's a humility to that, to me, that makes it much more authentic as a religious journey and as a religious pilgrimage. And the, as John likes to use this word in the positive sense, the humiliation of the project is, I think, what makes it trustworthy to me. And so there's the fundamental idea of the Silk Road as being that, as being a journey to discover that native language within that commends us to the character we must become in order to access the self that we are and become that and become unto it in a way that we can realize ourselves in relation to the sacred. Maybe not in a way that is identical with any one person, but I think it's much easier for us to find, to accord and find peace in our relations with other people if we find the home within, as opposed to the home underneath a canopy grouped with a bunch of people who may have a very different idea of what this is to them.
First of all, I want to respond to that, Andrew, and then I'll let you take us further. Thank you for that, Chris. I think, as he frequently does, Chris articulated the exact point. And the exact point was the shift from a very almost imperious, top-down orientation with the religion that's not a religion, an engineering attitude or stance, to one that is properly from the standpoint of, humility. The attitude, the stance is one of inventio towards the advent of the sacred. I like that, actually. It's a nice turn of phrase, inventio towards the advent. And I think that's exactly to the point. And I just want to reinforce that shift that he is pointing to in the orientation, the standpoint and the stance. I think that is fundamental. He fundamentally articulated what is central and crucial about the shift from the religion that's not a religion to the philosophical Silk Road. As he said, obviously it takes discipline. Discipline means to follow. And if you're going to walk a road, you better follow a path, right? You just can't wander aimlessly. But that discipline is always within inventio, that is in service of the Advent. So first of all, I want to thank Chris for that. I think that was astonishingly articulate and to the point, and I'm grateful for that.
No, I love that too. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead, Andrew.
No, I was just saying I love very much that as a image which is contrary to the sort of reactionary movement of religion. Yes. That you feel that people are going back to that because they want the safety of a prescribed kind of modality of religion. It could be in the Christian or the Buddhist, or any religion. Whereas this is a very open path in the sense that one could be, a Buddhist or a Christian, or whatever, and then, but still visit these other places, and because there is no thing called called a Christian or a Buddhist, or like there's a uniqueness to every particular journey, which has a whole tapestry of different influences.
Yeah, and not only individually but collectively. I mean, the advent of Christianity transformed Judaism. The advent of Islam transformed Christianity. These religions, they don't remain isolated from each other. There's always this toing and froing and mutual transformation, some of it hostile, some of it friendly. And I want to say to people, I'm under no delusions. The actual Silk Road, which was for commerce and also the trade of ideas, there was violence and bloodshed and warfare associated with it. I'm idealizing from that what it created. It created a lingua philosophica, right? It created this pathway where you had sort of Neoplatonism from the West and Zen from the East reaching towards each other, being influenced by Vedanta and other things along the way. Now, about the issue about homeless, I agree with Chris, and I think the move is from the cynics who thought you had to, is a particular physical home that you had to abandon, to the Stoics, as Chris said, and the Socratic sense of being cosmopolitan, where the cosmos was your polis, that you're at home in the cosmos. And I think the part of that is the recovery of something which is now becoming increasingly more scientifically plausible and increasingly more realizable in practice, which is a recovery, and I mean that in like the Tolkien sense, of the microcosmic, macrocosmic relationship, mutual internalization and indwelling. And that recovery of that profound interpenetration, I think is, and finding that through line is exactly what we're talking about. It's that sense of home. And this has again landed for me very personally, very recently. I was very honored when Jordan Peterson called me and invited me to participate in his next big series, the Gospel Seminar. And as somebody who has a very fraught relationship with Christianity, I don't know if that's the right word, I was there, and I made it very clear. In fact, Jordan, at one point, we were doing individual interviews, and I was saying how I'm there as a non-theist, a Zen Neoplatonist non-theist, and a skeptic in the ancient sense of deep inquirer and open and wanting to hear. And the director said, "You just made that up right now? Like that just came out of you?" And Jordan said, "That's why he's here. Like they wanted me here for that." And they thanked me for it. And so I want to make very clear that I was well received and welcomed, and I participated in a way that I think, in a virtuous sense, I'm very proud of. But as I was doing this, and I did that long preamble because I don't want people to misinterpret what I'm saying, right? I came to the a great peace, and I'm reading a lot of books on Jesus, some of them from Christians, some of them from Zen Buddhists, which has been really wonderful. Sally McFagg's presentation on the parables and her proposal that Jesus is the parable of God. All of this was just resonating with all of this. But a great peace. All this when you try to talk this way, you sound like you're in an old time Disney movie or a Hallmark commercial. It's frustrating. Um, a great peace came over me because I realized, and I really mean this in a very kind way, my longing to return to Christianity and the envy I had fell away from me. And I felt deeply, deeply at peace. And I can't, and the problem I'm struggling with is that sounds very negative. That sounds like I finally was completely orphaned and homeless. And in one sort of technical sense, that's true. But I found that I had come into a more living relationship with Jesus of Nazareth. Um, and I am not criticizing the Christianity that was made present to me because I was very impressed by it. And I want everybody to hear that. I'm very respectful of it and appreciative of it. I learned a lot. Genuine dialogos was taking place repeatedly. But I just realized that the Silk Road and what it is coming to mean for me is giving me that peace. And yeah.
John, when you're talking, I felt shivers all over me because there's a way in which I find the return to Christianity, like I'm sympathetic to Christianity as well, but in a way I have the feeling that it's like it's starting a war or something, or it's a conflict, between Christianity and Islam, or between Christianity and there's a lot of really intelligent Christians and out there, but they seem to have a wall around them. They don't seem to be open. I don't want to speak for all Christians or anything like that, because
Yeah.
I had a good conversation with Jordan Hall about his conversion, and
Yes.
I do listen to Jordan and the Exodus series, and I listen to that stuff, but I have a feeling it's us against the world or something, that there's a real strong lines being drawn, which feels somewhat dangerous to me. Does
Well,
that make
one of the
sense?
yes, it does. And that was definitely there. Not so much on camera, but off scene. And the privilege I had was both off scene and especially on camera. I I made a critique of what is now being called cultural Christianity. And I think cultural Christianity is a great, Richard Dawkins has just came out as a cultural Christian. And of course, it's part of the defense against Islam, the defense of Western civilization against Islam. And Islam is not innocent in any of this. Religions are capable of being
Yeah.
aggressive and adopting a conquest mentality, and there's certainly aspects of Islam like that. But of course, there is and has been aspects of that in Christianity and everything else.
Mhm.
And so I was able to criticize and critique in the philosophical sense cultural Christianity because I think it is a great disservice to what Jesus of Nazareth was trying to share with people because it instrumentalizes Christianity and
There you
therefore
go. Yeah.
fundamentally perverts it from what it is supposed to be and how it is supposed to operate. And so I stand, and I'll say it here publicly, I stand against cultural Christianity and for overlapping because they're not identical, but for similar reasons against Christian nationalism. Both of those are instrumentalizations of Christianity and idolatrous putting it in service of what their true God really is, which is Western civilization on one hand and the United States of America on the other. And I do not regard either one of those as proper entities for ultimate concern or worship. I think that is a profound sin of idolatry. And sorry, you can hear the anger in my voice. And I think it is a great, great disservice. And if that is what Christianity is turning towards, and I don't believe it is, but if it somehow weirdly turns out that that is what Christianity turns towards, then I will stand against that Christianity, because I think it has nothing but it is nothing but an idolatrous perversion of the spirit that lived in Jesus of Nazareth.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Yeah, I think I'm fully on board with that. That's what you articulated what I was feeling. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Any comments, thoughts about this, Chris?
I mean, I agree. John knows I agree. Deeply, deeply, deeply. This is not a new problem. It's not a new critique. It goes back a fair ways, but it's certainly as present now as it has ever been. The idea that Christianity is something that you culturally absorb or dispose yourself to as part of a collective that turns towards some practical worldly affair. And I think the idea of instrumentalizing it in service of another good, I think that's a really good way of putting it. Putting it in terms of that kind of idolatry, I think, is exactly right. And the idea that you can systematize Christianity into a set of values or beliefs about, or a fleet of ethical standards that don't have to do with the core orientation of having a relationship with the person or persons, of the divine, if I can put it that way. The idea that you can be a Christian without actually trying to cultivate a mysterious relationship with, Jesus.
It's interesting. Like this triumphalist mode of Christianity is the opposite of Christianity. It's like the Antichrist or something, right?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, that makes me think of, it kind of makes me think of Jung a little bit, right? One of Jung's sort of great comments was that one of the things that Christianity never fully did, never evolved into, was a proper integration of the Antichrist that was produced from itself. And that is a project, I think, in many ways that continues Christianity. Like John said, it's true. I mean, it's not static. It's not immutable. It's not standing still. Nothing does. Nothing does. It continues to work itself through us and evolve through us and through our understanding of it. And that somehow what we give back to it, the way that we understand it and the way that we somehow comport ourselves changes the very thing that we behold. So the stakes are always high. But the idea that Christianity is a cultural ethic rather than a fundamental, a relationship with being that is made manifest in relationship to Jesus Christ. That is, to me, the essence of what Christianity is, right? And that, of course, is bound in the virtue of love. But that the idea that there is a Christianity that does not have that as its absolute cynosure, as the center of it, that binds it all together. I mean, if we're not talking about that, then what are we talking about? We're not talking about anything, really. We're just talking about some kind of worldly ethic that has used Christianity to execute itself. Basically.
Yeah, I'm so happy to hear this, like, from you guys, because this is just not the culture war, and I'm so tired of the culture war. I don't want to engage in that at all, and I think people have to go beyond that on some level and have have this kind of conversation.
I think the other thing is that the idea that you reason your way into it, the idea that you can represent it, like representations of Christian doctrine, representations of a Christian ethic are just that, right? They're scaled versions of trying to they're refractions of something that's nameless, right? I mean, I think that, to me, that we have to come back to something properly apophatic, I think, when we come back to Christianity, and that central relationship is made flesh so that it can be made known and present and embodied, and so that it can actually get intelligible traction in our nervous system somehow, to me, right? That to me is like the importance of the embodiment of that symbol. And that relationship is so important because it makes manifest and present, something that is otherwise, I think, in the Neoplatonic tradition, I find a little bit more difficult to access when it is abstracted into a fleshless kind of reality.
Got it. Yeah.
And there is something about the embodiment of that reality in the prism of or in the matrix of the human relationship that is our deepest, deepest, deepest touchstone to what is most real and visceral within us, that gives it its power, right? Whether the Christian symbolic framework is essential is kind of a difficult question to answer, right? Like we're getting into like levels of reality that we don't even have access to, and I really have no interest in accessing because of the sheer unknowability of them. But the fact of the matter is, what makes the infinite and the mysterious present to us such that we can relate to it deeply in a way that touches us and feels most real in us, and such that we can become in its likeness. To me, that is the power of Christianity. I'm not arguing for its essentialism or its supremacy over other traditions. To me, it's just like a pointless question, right? It's a question of personal relationship that matters. It's not a question of abstracting into metaphysical certitudes. That's where I think we often go wrong. I'm getting into a rant, guys. Sorry. I think that's where we often go wrong. We often go wrong. Right? We try and abstract ourselves away from what is real in our experience. And when we start doing that, and we start systematizing things and generalizing them and creating these hierarchies, we just miss the plot completely, because we miss what is most real in our own experience, right? And so someone doesn't find that in Christianity, fair enough. But I think that, those who find a great depth in that, find a depth in the texture of the capacity to relate to that which exceeds our comprehension so thoroughly that we can never hope to grasp it. And that's something about making that present in the very thing that we know so deeply, which is the reality of our own human relationships. We somehow gain access to what is inaccessible. And that doesn't scale into the body politic. That doesn't scale into ideological ethics. It just doesn't scale that way. And if someone wants to make that leap, whatever they're doing, it's not Christianity, Anyway.
Great. Yeah. I mean, I can accept that as a Buddhist, totally. I mean, sorry, John's going to speak for a while, so just let me say that it's like I really, it's a fundamental sort of, I can translate everything you say into Buddhist language, and I don't have a problem. There's no problem. And I was just speaking to a tantric, Vajrayana master, who was saying that the Mass is the ultimate tantric ritual. It's you're drinking the blood of Christ and the body of. So this is so deep that it's beyond any religious identity, I think.
So, man, I love you, my friend. I mean, oh, my gosh, the spirit in you is just so astonishingly beautiful. And I mean that in the profound Platonic sense of what beauty is. Do you see how he was exemplifying the very thing I was trying to put into words about Christianity being transformed and recovered as it enters into walking the philosophical Silk Road? And then you, Andrew, started walking with him, accompanying him.
Yeah.
And it's not like you found some logical identity in propositions,
Oh,
some
yeah.
pathetic perennialism between Buddhism and Christianity. You found this through line that allows you to translate without logical identification or reduction so that you can accompany each other. I mean, that is the philosophical Silk Road right there. It
Right. We
happened
did
in
it.
front of your
Yeah.
eyes.
Cool. That's very cool. Yeah.
Now, to the point that Chris made, I think, I mean, so I think Chris also exemplifies his patron philosopher, Kierkegaard, because Kierkegaard's great critique of Christendom in
Mm.
favor, in
Oh,
service of Christianity, I think is now cuttingly relevant. And everybody who's thinking about Christianity needs to read Kierkegaard deeply because his critique of Christendom coming from the heart of Christianity, and Chris has internalized this profoundly, I think is relevant, super relevant right now. Now, in connection with that, for me, and I hope also for Chris, and helped by Jacob Howland, we did after Socrates, we did the series within the series where Kierkegaard is basically doing an unresolvable, intended so, an infinite game in James Carson's sense between Socrates and Jesus. And he keeps looking like he's going to resolve it, and then he keeps toeing back and toing and froing back and forth. And there's this ongoing reciprocal opening, the tonos, this creative tension between Socrates and Jesus. And where I was sort of taking the role, we're both being pretentious, and so take it with a grain of salt. I was taking the role of Socrates, and Chris was sort of speaking through Kierkegaard of Jesus as the Christ. Cosmic Christ, especially. And for me, part of that, see, that was part of that piece. Because there was a stage in the Jesus seminar where I said, I'm deeply committed. I'm being as sincere, as honest as I can to a committed relationship and participation in the logos, because they were talking about the logos in Christianity, and they're deeply, and I were talking about all of this in practice and right in the very allowing it to go into the very warp and woof of my psyche and myself and my personhood. And then, right, but they said, well, then why aren't you a Christian? And I said, because I actually respect Christianity, and it makes certain claims that I can't accept, right? And I don't know. I make a distinction, and it's a valuable distinction. I'm not throwing the distinction away between what is psychologically indispensable and what is metaphysically necessary. An easy example is it's psychologically indispensable for my cognition, English, right? But that doesn't mean all cognitive agents have to speak English. It's not metaphysically necessary, but it's indispensable for me given my background. And there's things about, right? I can't tell about my inability to take on Christianity if it's because I found certain things that I don't agree with metaphysically, or because there's just psychologically indispensable things about me because I had a traumatic relationship with Christianity. And I've stopped trying to find, because I think they bleed into each other. I was treating it as if there was this fine line and easy distinction between them, but it's not so easy when you get into the depths of the psyche between what is indispensable to the psyche and what is metaphysically necessary to being a cognitive agent. Because we are, as Chris said, we are persons that take a personal stance. And so I stopped also trying to resolve the dialogos between Jesus and Socrates. And that is where I dwell now. That is where I dwell now. And so I think that is, I think I talk about the symphony of sages. I think the Silk Road is also a way of people getting to live what you and Chris just demonstrated. Buddha and Jesus, the symphony of sages, the music took hold, and the Buddhist part of it and the Jesus part of it, the Christian part of it, aren't identical, but they fit together. They belong together. We talk about musical accompaniment for a reason. There's a symphony there going on. There's a symphony of sages. And I think another way of thinking about the Silk Road is singing the song of the symphony of the sages, so that this become what you both of you just so beautifully exemplified, becomes available to us as an alternative to let's draw up the battle lines and see who's going to win in the zero-sum battle.
I rejoice at the peace you're describing, John. This just letting go. Just letting go. Like it's like we spend so much of our time inwardly clenched and in a state of perpetual strain when we come up against apparently insoluble questions and feel as though we have to resolve those questions and bring everything into order. And if only we could understand more, if only we could understand more, if only we could understand more in ever finer degrees of resolution, we could somehow force upon ourselves a peace and a coherence. And one of the things I'm hearing from you is that you're getting to a point where you realize that some things within are in fact insoluble, or some things within are perhaps indecipherable, even when subject to the fastidious kind of analysis that only someone like you could bring to them. And if at the end of all of that, they're still insoluble, that there's some mystery beneath them having to do with your relationship, that you now have the opportunity to let go and step back and let be what is. And it occurs to me that any real resolution, and the nameless kind of resolution, the kind of resolution that could never be reduced to a proposition, that could never be adequately explained, but known within in terms unknown, is the kind of resolution that could only be made possible by the act of letting it go, by the act of making peace with the incomprehensibility of certain realities within us and allowing them to be what they are. And perhaps in letting them be, there's a chance that greater understanding comes from relinquishing a certain hold over them.
I think that's beautifully well said. The way I've been thinking about this is as I have been shifting the emphasis from propositional contradiction to performative contradiction, right? Not that propositional contradiction doesn't matter, but that performative contradiction is way more important. I've also correspondingly shifted from propositional resolution to performative resolution, which of course Kierkegaard does recommend and Socrates does recommend. And there's a way in which you can't resolve these. And this is where the Taoist training comes in, the Wu Wei. You can't resolve the tonos of the yin and the yang. If you try to resolve it, you are misunderstanding and misapprehending it. But you can you can do a performative resolution in which you commit yourself to being responsible to it and faithful to it as the thing that is beyond your final conceptualization. And I think that personal resolution, which I think is something what Kierkegaard meant by faith, purity of heart, I think is what really, really matters ultimately for bringing about the cultivation of wisdom and virtue. And along the way, I mean, I've been doing a lot of work about the imaginal and then how it feeds into the imaginal within the rational and the rational within the imaginal. And I think Jesus and Socrates are both figures that are properly, and the Buddha are properly imaginal. And that they enliven and vitalize the ritual and practice within an ecology of practices in a way in which no proposition ever can. And therefore that personal resolution to follow their way, I think, is actually more important. Again, I don't want people to mishear me as some kind of lackadaisical romantic. Resolving propositional contradiction is important. Getting conceptual clarity is important. But in the end, the cultivation of wisdom is not driven by that. Those are merely necessary and very far from sufficient conditions. And one of the gifts that came out of the gospel seminar is Jesus is imaginal for me now.
Oh, interesting. I was thinking that when you guys were talking about, something a Zen master I heard, I met once said that, like, the function of religion is to save people from themselves, on some level, and that struck me as true. And then he said Zen is not a religion, so there is a way. So there's a way in which I was thinking about what it means to be like saved, right? So there's a way in which there's that Christianity does this dirty trick and says if you don't follow Jesus, you're going to go to hell and you won't be saved. And but I always like the idea of universal salvation better. So the people who are within the religion and the people without are equally saved. It's just a long process of, and they're not saved by taking on any kind of dogma or propositional, whatever. The conversion is a deep conversion of, a deep transformation, which can occur inside or outside the religion.
Jesus, the verse that is often quoted is misquoted. Jesus didn't say, believe in my doctrine. He said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one cometh to the Father but by me. Well, that means Christianity. He didn't say Christianity is the way. He said, I am the way. And what is he? He is the Logos. He's the parable of God. The resolution to be faithful to the Logos, which we practice in dialectic into dialogos. That, to my mind, and I presented that to the seminar, I said, to my mind, that is the way of, right, living out that verse that Jesus was talking about. And again, there was a very, welcoming reception to that proposal. And I think the disservice, and this is a tricky thing to say, but it goes towards the Christendom and Christianity distinction. I think the way Christianity has often identified itself with Jesus, as if it is Jesus, is problematic in some ways. And it leads to a kind of idolatry of Christianity itself. One of the things that gets in the way between Christians and Jesus is Christianity, paradoxically, really paradoxically. And I don't say that as some kind of harsh village atheist, right? I'm not the village idiot. I'm trying to say this from deep respect and and understand. I'm trying to say it as much as I can from the inside, and so I think Christianity needs to rethink what that very provocative verse. One of the reasons I went is because I knew Douglas Headley was going to there. We sort of hit it off in Cambridge, but we didn't have time to gel, and so we got quite close. And he said there's now very good argument and evidence that's upturning things. It looks like John might be the earliest gospel, because John is so philosophical and everything. That was always the story that John is very much later and very far removed from the historical Jesus. But there's all this new scholastic work saying John might be the closest to the historical Jesus. Of course,
John the least dogmatic of the
but John is the one that presents Jesus in the most divine light.
Divine
light, and that has tended to be easily assimilated to the doctrinal structure of Christianity. But right, what I'm saying is, if that verse is in John and John is closer, there's something going on there. And is Jesus really proposing the adherence to a set of propositions when it means to understand that he is the way? I don't think so. I think he's what the gospel, what the letter to the Hebrews says. He is the visible icon of the radiance of God, of the invisible God. And I think that's what it means. And I think to follow him, as John says, is to become exactly like him as much as we possibly can, to become sons and daughters of God. See, this is what often happens to me. I end up talking the language of Christianity from somebody who is actually trying to criticize Christianity and perhaps call it back to what it should be in my mind.
It's funny. I was thinking about Jordan Hall and our conversation, and I'm very fond of Jordan. I always felt that there was something profoundly like Christian in his spirit, before he converted, that a lot of the times what he was talking about, like, was Christianity. What he was looking for was a church, and what he was looking for were these things, and then
Exactly.
kind of found it in Christianity. But that was already there on some level, and it's that there's a lot of people who aren't within Christianity who have a sort of a Christian operating system. That's a ugly metaphor, but
And that's the obverse of what I was talking about a few minutes
yeah,
ago. There are many people, I think, who are deeply Christian, like Jordan, without
yeah,
realizing it. And for them, that is what I mean, where people who can come home to Christianity via the philosophical Silk Road. I was just talking to Jordan yesterday. He said, he said he makes a joke about me being like a gateway drug into Christianity for people.
yeah.
But I was talking to him about exactly that kind of thing, about how he recovered something that was all as you I think as you divined within him, right? Oh, nice play on words there. Sorry, you divined within him that uh, he was looking for what I think Christianity at its best offers people, and he found it. And a lot of people don't understand why he's at home, but like just the way he shows up. Like Jordan's a dear friend, and I love him. And so I say this from that perspective. I said this to him, and I've said this to other people, and they've acknowledged it. Jordan is warmer than he ever was before he became officially a Christian. It
Yeah.
gave him access to a depth of himself and an affective, in the good sense of the word, side of himself that he couldn't get otherwise. He couldn't
Maybe
get
that's what
from.
it means to be saved, to recover that warmth of humanity, um, in a
That's a
sense.
good enough
To
answer.
not, because you could live in a very, there's so many philosophers out there who are very cold, they're not in the heart. They've developed a huge conceptual, you know, structures, which are even unbelievably incredible. But then they're not in the heart. I think, like, I always think of I'm very fond of the mystic Gurdjieff, and he talks about three brains. We have three brains, and a lot of people are, the philosophers are really in just so mental, and I find it but I think that was the pain that Jordan was feeling in many ways, and what he was searching for really is the heart. If I could be so
But he found the language of the
prosaic.
philosophical Silk Road very helpful. Like
Yeah.
that's what he meant. Like a lot of the work I did on Neoplatonism, and his reading of James Filler's astonishing book, Heidegger, Neoplatonism, and the history of being. Right. He found that the Silk Road helped him recover in the Tolkien sense, helped him recover Christianity, and
And it might
again,
help somebody recover Buddhism or
yes, yes.
Sufism or any other kind of religion, I think is what you're saying. It would just
Well, we
help somebody recover. Like, the religion we choose is the one we're most fond of, that we like the best, right? In a way.
but not in a facile way.
Not in,
Like
no, not in a facile
not on
way.
I
a
don't think we
consumerist.
choose
Oh,
it.
that's I like. I'll have one of those,
No, no,
and I'll have
no.
one of those. It's not that. It's not that.
No,
No, I don't
It's
think we
but it
choose
is
it.
the one
causal.
you fall. It's more like falling in love, right? It's like,
Exactly.
it's
That is
not,
the appropriate metaphor.
it's
It's the
not
one you fall in
choosing.
love with.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
That's what
It
it
is the
is.
one
Yeah.
you fall in love with. Exactly.
Because that's funny, because I was in my discussion with Jordan also, I was talking about how he thinks through everything, because he's a philosopher. I'm just not a philosopher by nature. I'm and how I became a Buddhist very early, because of falling in love with certain people. It almost had nothing to do with the doctrine, or it was just the beauty of it, right? So it was an instantaneous reaction, and so I started sitting in zazen and in temple in Buddhist temples. And then later I sort of started to think about what it means, and then I even, I started to think about Christianity and other religions. But for him, he had to sort of think his way through there until, and then fall into it or something.
But he met people.
Very interesting. Yeah.
I think that's a pivotal point. This also came up when the discussions I
Hmm.
was having in Nashville. Nobody is fundamentally, ultimately persuaded to do a metanoia through a set of propositions. Again, the
Hmm.
propositions can be valuable. what changes people is meeting people. That I'm
Yeah.
meeting them deeply, like you said, falling in love with them, not erotically, or at least not in our current sense of erotically, but philaically and agapically, right? Like it's people that are the portals of metanoia, and this is why any attempt to understand what happened to Jordan just as an inferential structuring of propositions that lead to a conclusion, I think is a mistake. I think
Mhm.
he went to a place where he found people living what he was looking for, and he fell in love with that. It's an entire way of life carried within and between people that really affords metanoia. The Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, right?
Yeah.
And Jesus, I am the way. Where two or three are gathered in my name, there I am also. Like this is the profound. And again, when you say it, if you say it just as the words, it sounds like a bloody Hallmark card. But if you can get to a place where that is shocking again and wakes you up, then you're getting it. Then
Yeah.
you're really getting it.
No, I agree. I didn't mean that in any negative
No, no, I
sense
wasn't.
towards him.
Andrew, I
I was
didn't think
thinking
you
about
were.
his just different styles of people,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
The fact that some people are in the Hindu tradition they talk about karma yoga people who work towards redemption. It's the work that
yeah,
does it.
yeah.
Other people are devotional and that's their primary. They're bhakti yogis, and then the Johnny yogas are the ones, and he's more like a Johnny yogi within that
Yes,
system,
yes.
if that makes any sense. I wasn't
No,
saying that
Andrew,
yeah,
please don't misunderstand me. I wasn't misattributing that to you. I wanted to foreclose on people who might have heard that in what you were saying. I
gotcha.
wasn't attributing that to you at all. And I wanted to make clear. And I think I want to go back to that. I knew about that taxonomy, but I'm thinking this is just it's something I think the Vervaeke Foundation should go back and look at again more carefully. These sort of four fundamental orientations that people have towards, right, the recovery or the falling in love with the sacred,
You said
because I think
four.
there's
I
something.
mentioned three. What's the fourth?
Well, I mean, there's the way of work, there's the way of devotion, there's the way of sort of mental training, and then there are people. This isn't in the, sorry, I'm blending traditions together and I shouldn't have done that. I apologize. That was a mistake. But then there's also the Zen idea of people who have a spontaneous sort of satori. There are people who it
Hmm.
it comes over them. There's no other way of putting it. And those people um, also have to be given a framework that is other than the way of work, the way of devotion, the way of mental training, the way of mental psychological training. That was the four that I was thinking of. The reason why the fourth one matters, just because just so I don't seem as just uselessly pedantic, pathetically pedantic, is 40% of the population approximately has profound anomalous experiences, mystical experiences, transformative experiences, visionary
Ah,
experiences. And there's no framework for them. There's no framework. That's part of the meaning crisis. And so they flail in many, many ways. And the psychedelic renaissance is just ramping all of that up,
yeah.
right? And people who have that happen to them, they need a different kind. You can't immediately say, well, go into work or go into mental cultivation or go into devotion. There's something else, uh, a way in which they need to be received into um, a relationship to ultimate reality. So that's what I meant by the fourth. Sorry, I was un, I was in my haste of thought, I was sloppy. I apologize.
You're forgiven, John. But yeah, yeah. Well, no, I thought that was very interesting. That fourth, and I'm still trying to wrap my mind about what that is. Maybe people who are or have a mystical nature or mystical experiences, or
There are people that
and
are on the margins of standard consciousness and sense of self,
yeah, for sure.
either by disposition, constitution, or because of these spontaneous occurrences. And they often are uncomfortable, at least initially, with sort of the tried and true pathways that have been laid out. They have a sense of overwhelming inventio uh, that has to be properly responded to. We can't just acquiesce in it because that will rabbit hole them in a lot of ways. But we also can't just try to immediately assimilate them into existing things because it trespasses on what they are rightly regarding, something we've been putting our finger on repeatedly here, as something utterly unique that has happened to them. And so that, to my pedagogical mind, that is the tricky part of it. The other three need to be properly represented, and I have too often overrepresented the philosophical and the mental cultivation and not given enough due regard to the devotional, which I'm trying to ameliorate right now in this conversation. But I also want to be properly responsive and responsible to the people who have these satori. I use the Zen term because there's no equivalent. The person who's sweeping, like these stories, a person who's sweeping in the garden and the stone hits the bench, and then they're suddenly enlightened. And it's like, what? Obviously, lots of stuff is happening, but
Yeah.
still, there's something to that that's just overwhelming, right?
Well, I know a yogi who, she can, in a matter of seconds, go into an extreme ecstatic state to the
Yes.
point where they might pass out, and that's not ordinary. That kind of person doesn't belong in an office. you know.
Yes. Yes.
So I fully agree with that.
There's a wildness to the sacred that we tend to over domesticate when with the three ways. We over domesticate work or intellectual, physical, or devotion, or psycho spiritual cultivation. We domesticate it and we lose the wildness. And I
Oh, the
think the
wildness
fourth,
is important. Yeah.
yeah, and I think the fourth is, it's my one of my favorite lines from C.S. Lewis. Aslan, Aslan, is he a tame lion? Oh, he's not tame, but he's
Mhm.
good, right? And that's like
That's
Lewis caught
crazy
something.
wisdom in our
Yeah,
tradition.
yeah.
Yeah.
Crazy wisdom. The fact that the numinous is terrifying in some aspects, like the wildness. And I think the fourth is like they duly represent the wildness of the numinous, of the
Mhm.
sacred, of the ultimately real.
And crazy wisdom doesn't mean crazy
That's right.
at
That's
all.
exactly right.
It's not some. It's a way of being that is not understandable, through our ordinary modes of understanding.
And and one of the things I got onto, and it took me over like a spirit when I was at the gospel seminar, was recovering the wildness of Jesus.
Nice.
I said the wildness, the strangeness, and what was I was really grateful for, happy, is everybody else took that up. They wanted to get back to, right? Like I was I deeply criticized the reduction of parables to children's stories or allegories. A parable has to be wild, undomesticated, or like a koan, or you're not getting it. And if you domesticate the parable, and if Jesus is the parable of God, you're domesticating Jesus and you're losing something essential to what he was portraying.
Hmm.
I'm talking too much. I want to hear what Chris has to say.
Yeah, me too. I was waiting to hear from Chris.
Yeah, there's so much. Um, I've swallowed a lot of things just because we've now moved past them. But one thing that one question that I often have, and it's a question I kind of hear in the offing here, is the relationship between the the relationship as domains of activity and study and experience between philosophy and the sacred, or philosophy and religious
Mm-hmm,
activity.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
And I've never been able to I've never been able to fully separate their relevance. I've never been able to fully separate them. It doesn't seem natural or intuitive to me to regard them as different projects. But obviously they are different in some very significant ways, And so one of the questions that I have right now is like, what is the sameness and difference between those domains and between those activities? And you know, especially when we talk about the volatility and the sort of chaotic and mercurial nature of the sacred and how we encounter it, and how untamed and destructive it can be if it's not approached perhaps if it's not approached with the right deportment. And then to me, that invites a question of what the role of philosophy is in helping to train that deportment. And I think in many ways, you know, you were talking a little while ago about, you know, Jordan as an exemplary kind of philosophically inquisitive mind, and how there's a contrast in some ways between the philosophical inquiry that is explorative and probing and constantly casts into doubt, constantly calls into question, and the simplicity, and I mean that in a positive sense, the simplicity of falling in love with a way that is religious, or that we would call religious. I find that word so difficult because, you know, let's say when I use the term religious, I really mean as related to the sacred or of the sacred.
I think falling in love with a way is good.
Falling in love with a way. But I think what happens in so many ways, and what I remember hearing from Jordan and what that I've felt and seen in others, is that falling in love with the ways, falling in love with well, in some ways it's falling in love with the experience of being loved. I think that's really what it is in Christianity, is it's falling in love with the experience of being loved. It's falling in love with a certain kind of agapic solicitude, right? It's what is meant by the idea of God being agape. And there is a process that often a person has to go through, canonically speaking, in order to even be prepared to encounter an experience like that, and to be receptive to it such that it's possible at all, right? You can't just fall in love because something strikes you unawares, and that can happen. It can happen to certain people, I think, more than others. I think because certain people are disposed in such a way that they have a kind of receptivity or a natural openness, a natural vulnerability that allows them to be so struck, and that allows them to unneurotically experience that kind of divine solicitude, that mysterious kind of love that there is no accounting for, that simply accounts for itself as inherently meaningful and inherently virtuous. But I think not everyone has that vulnerability. And I'm not speaking in a judgmental sense. I'm also speaking reflexively, right? I know I don't always have it. And I know that a lot of people don't always have it, because there is something mysterious and unjustified about it, right? We can think of all kinds of reasons to distrust it, and all kinds of reasons to deny it. And it is the denial of that which is unaccountable in that agapic solicitude that is, in the Christian canon, the deepest sin, right? It is the denial of the love. And that's really what it means to not be saved. It is simply to be in denial.
In denial, yeah.
Of some of something that is so fundamentally real that its reality cannot be accounted for. Its reality cannot be accounted for. Its reality cannot be justified, right? Error and sin, if I can use that term, can be justified given the decrepitudes inherent to our nature, and that the fact that that seems to be in some ways the thing that is most natural to us. But there is something about that, the fullness of that solicitude, that remakes people. and in virtue of which people are remade, that is unaccountable. And therefore, it's also easy to deny. Okay, so then, if some people are disposed to fall in love with that experience, such that they take it upon themselves and then become vessels of it and for it, and become that transitive property that confers it back out onto the world, they become carriers of it. That's what it means to become in the image of Christ, right? Is to carry forth that love and participate in it, but not participate in it as though you're feeding off of it. Participate in it insofar as you become it. You become. There is no distinction anymore between what you are and that in itself that now you are remade into. And that's what the grace that we can sometimes behold when someone is struck by the way that they fall in love with and become that way that they fall in love with. That grace, I think, has something to do with that experience. Okay, so then if that is the religious experience, the experience that we don't rationalize our way into, that we don't infer our way into, that simply it strikes us and we fall in love with it, and it remakes our way of being in the world, then what then is this role of philosophy that is much more about the process of inquiring, the process of probing and trading propositions? Not just that, of course, but starts there, right? The process of ideation, the process of argumentation, the process of the dialectic. What does that do, and what relationship does that have to the sensitization, to being able to fall in love with something more real than you've ever known before?
Oh, I lost your uh-oh.
Hear you. How about now, guys?
Yeah, you're back.
Yeah, you're back.
Okay, sorry about that. I didn't realize that I was fading. I was cutting out. So then the question is, okay, well, then what is then the role of philosophy in relation to that project? Like, they could easily be two completely different things belonging to two different categories of life, and never the twain shall meet. But of course, John invoked Kierkegaard earlier, in the relationship between Socrates and Jesus. I feel quite certain that there is a deep relationship between those things. So then what is the relationship? What is the relationship? What is the role of philosophy in the sensitizing the vulnerability to falling in love with the sacred, and therefore with that which is most real? And I think in many ways, and this is really how we teach the dialectic practice when we teach it, it is a kind of existential decluttering when it is performed Socratically, right? That in some ways, I suspect that the role of, this is my proposal for it anyway, that I suspect that the role of philosophy, Socratically speaking, is to turn transparent those invisible beliefs that are actually circumscribing our sensitivity to those mysteries that exceed us, to get them out of the way, that it actually has a negative function, an ironic function, which is to disabuse ourselves of those systems of perception and conception, those paradigmatic beliefs, the pathologos, as Grimes called them, those sick beliefs that are actually standing between us and the capacity to be humbled before something mysterious, in virtue of which we can be remade. So philosophy as being a kind of an existential decluttering of the psyche, but one that actually has to traverse all of the different forms of knowing and knowledge in order for that project to be possible. It has a propositional correlate. It has a procedural correlate, to use John's typology. So I think that this is a really important question, because too often I feel like these projects are considered to be separate things, or they're just conflated as being one thing, and both of them are somehow wrong to me. I think it's really important to understand how the philosophical disposition, with all of its rigor and inquiry and discipline, is trying to clean and organize and tidy and remove those obfuscating systems of patterns of behavior and belief that are actually closing us off to those things that have the capacity to conduct us into those aspects of reality that awaken us to the well, to ourselves. And anyway, that was a little longer than I intended, but I
No, I
wanted
want to
to,
take this question up. I want
I
to take this up.
wanted, I want to give that proposal to you. I want to see what you do with it, because I want both of you, because I want to understand that relationship better, because I think that relationship it's going to be really important to the Silk Road, because you're making a philosophical argument in service of sensitizing an encounter with the sacred. So clearly there must be a relationship between those things. And I want to understand how they function with one another.
I've been thinking, of course, in a convergent way, of course. I mean, there's the simpatico between us is pronounced. So I think philosophy is not just the love of wisdom. It is that love of wisdom that affords us loving wisely. And falling in love with somebody is not sufficient for loving them wisely. It is necessary, but not sufficient. And what is it to love somebody wisely? I think there is the decluttering, the existential decluttering, but I think there is also, I think there is the cultivation of virtue and virtuosity with respect to the beloved. And that's what I mean by loving wisdom allows you to love wisely. That's abstractly. A little bit more concretely, the work I've been doing, there's two currents. So let me just mention both, and then I'll turn it over to Andrew. I've been trying to show how profoundly at the heart of the rational is the imaginal and the ritual. I've been making argument after argument. To me, that is the religious argument. That is the religious movement, to see that within your heart of the rational is the imaginal ritual, the ritual imaginal. But the reverse is also the case. There is also the rational within the imaginal. Now, it's not normally the rationality of, it's not exclusively or centrally the rationality of propositional coherence. It is the avoiding, the overcoming of performative contradiction. And there is a normativity to ritual? Does it transfer broadly and deeply to many domains of your life? Does it transfer broadly and deeply many levels of the psyche? That is a normativity. That is a ratio. That is a ratio that is moving away from performative contradiction and trying to bring about those two things that make up anagogy, that inner justice and that deep connectedness to reality. And I think that is the rational within the imaginal. That's the philosophical. So the imaginal within the rational is the religious. The rational within the imaginal is the philosophical. And when we do them both, we not only love wisdom, we love wisely. And each is irreducible to the other, but they are inseparably bound together. That is my sort of where my thinking is now in answer to, because you're right, you are absolutely right. This is a central question in that is required to at least begin answering, or at least questing upon, if I'm going to be properly prepared, if we are going to be properly prepared, because you're going to join me on a lot of this journey, for the pilgrimage of the philosophical Silk Road. That's my initial, and the person, and this is the second, the person that has really sung this to me, and I'm doing this course for Halkyn Academy, Ultimate Reality, God and Beyond, and we're doing Nishida, and we're doing it through Robert Carter, Canadian, his astonishingly great book, The Nothingness Beyond God, and he talks about, because Nishida is a deep practitioner of Zen, but he never, ever for a moment gives up his profound commitment to being a philosopher. So Zen takes him into the imaginal ritual realization of no-thingness, but this Neoplatonic exploration into intelligibility, and by the way, he even explicitly calls it that, titles one book around that, right, gets him to basho, the ultimate pure relationality that makes all intelligibility possible, right? And the two are constantly singing to each other, because the articulation of the basho prevents performative contradiction, overly simplistic reductions, a failure of imagination for the religious experience. And the religious experience keeps driving the philosophical inquiry deeper and deeper and deeper. And so I think of him as the patron saint of Zen Neoplatonism, and he uses Neoplatonism. He's read the Neoplatonic philosophers. Of course, he's deeply, deeply internalized Heidegger. And given Fuller's argument, Heidegger is the great attempt to return to Neoplatonism within Western philosophy. And that's why the proposal of Zen Neoplatonism is an attempt to, not just in words, but in exemplification, answer the question you have posed. It's about a performative resolution, not just a conceptual resolution.
Yeah. Well, can I? Yeah, I had a lot of thoughts actually about that when you were talking. And forgive me for being too Buddhist here, giving a Buddhist answer.
I don't think that's a sin.
Well, it is if it's just it's a sin if I'm just repeating a bunch of Buddhist phrases that I've learned from a book.
Okay, fair enough.
If I'm not really engaging, but I was thinking of the word view, like you cultivate a view, and they talk about view in Buddhism. So philosophy is about cultivating a view, I would say. But also, I don't think it's just about decluttering. I think there's a playful aspect as well. So you declutter, but also you discover, in the tantric tradition, they talk about twilight language, the language of the dakinis, which is, again, I think that's the imaginal area that John was
exactly. There's
pushing
that play.
into. So it's
play.
Not just decluttering. Decluttering is sort of sutric early Buddhism, and then you move into the more playful, embodied aspects.
Exactly.
And I was also thinking about, Buddhist
Andrew,
practice.
one quick point.
Please.
Those are interlocked. In order to have serious play, you have to safety frame. That's just play research.
Absolutely.
You have to do the decluttering Chris has talked about, so you have the space and the framing in which the serious play can actually take on life. I just wanted to say that.
Absolutely. So, I think you need to be more sutric when you become tantric in a way, because you have to be very, very careful when you're dealing with more dangerous kinds of energies and things like that. I could give you just personal example of the practices you would do, right? So you would practice view, the pre-preliminaries, and then you would do 100,000 prostrations or something like that, right? And then you would give up everything, like in a symbolic manner, by making mandala offerings, and then you would do a zillion, bajillion mantras, so that your mind and body are decluttered, so that you can go into that space. So I think that's built into the traditional things, which are very. I think you need to go through a process, but again, it's not a process of getting something, as you were saying, because it's not. That's just practice. That's not grace. That's practice.
You have to become the kind of person that can engage in certain kinds of cognitive and conceptual actions. This is part of the transformative truth proposal. Some truths are only available, disclosable to us, because we have to become the kind of people that can think the thoughts that are receptive to those truths, and that is, yeah, that is, I think that is the part that religion, but also what you might call the religious side of philosophy, is calling us to. But that's what you again picked up, I think, very well. I was trying to put together Chris's proposal of the decluttering, which I think of as the safety framing that they talk about in play literature, and the serious play.
The wildness too that we've talked about before.
The wildness and the serious play.
How do you get into the wildness? You don't start with wildness, because then you just auto-destruct, right?
Oh yeah. But that's it. So the serious play is where the inventio of religion takes place, right? And that's what I was trying to get at with the imaginal. And the ritual is imaginally augmented serious play that is powering transformative experience, so that we can properly aspire to be the people that are receptive to the more deeper truths of ultimate reality. That's what ritual is. And I think that is something that philosophy, right, is in service to. But I think it's also something that powers philosophy, because and Plato knew this. He talks about that there's this thing going on beyond the argumentation and the conceptual. There's something in the drama and the presence of the personage of Socrates that seduces people into the philosophical life and carries them towards the good.
Oh,
It's like,
sorry.
Sorry, Andrew, just very, very quickly. I mean, one of the ways of thinking about this that connects both, again, connects the philosophical to the sacred a little bit more clearly is that the idea that you have to be sort of brought to exhaustion. You have to be brought to exhaustion of your worldview. You have to be brought to exhaustion of your capacity, brought to exhaustion of the thoughts you think and the ideas you have and the words you use, right? That somehow all of that needs I mean, John, you've been describing the process of purgation in advance of the Silk Road. And I think that either we think of this philosophically or we think of it religiously, but in either case, there is a purgation. There's a purgation of that which you have at your disposal and the drying out of what you have at your disposal. And I think that, what is it that calls a person to the necessity of having to change, to the necessity of having to wander somewhere that we've never wandered before? And I think it's in some sense, if we're not predisposed to desire such things, it's the exhaustion of where we are in situ that I think provokes the appetite. And I think that's where the Socratic project and the overtly religious project speak to one another more profoundly.
I think there's a way in which, just to go back to some of the Cogsci literature, you have to sort of exhaust the work frame in order to do the reversal, the metanoia, into the play frame.
Right.
And so also, so you don't try to reduce, you don't get the modal confusion that Fromm worried about. You don't try to reduce or logically identify them, and you properly see that both are needed and they're in proper relationship to each other.
Yeah. In Gurdjieff's work, his first books were designed to kind of written to be written to the unconscious, to try to undermine our mechanical thought patterns in every possible way. Before you would go into his second series of books was like how to bring Christian mysticism in contact with the East and West, and how to find an actual path. That was the Meetings with Remarkable Men, and then the third one was sort of the more secret one, which is ineffable and not easily describable. So I think that exhaustion process is fundamental, the exhaustion of samsara in the practices. I think you would exhaust yourself philosophically, you exhaust yourself, in your physical knots in your body, and then the emotionality and all of that it's a process of exhaustion, so that a new kind of energy can arise inside of you, which is more distilled, or it's very alchemical.
Yeah, but think about, let's play with the analogy. I mean, you can physically exhaust yourself by just leaping around chaotically, right? Or there's the kind of dexterous flowing, right, exhaustion that comes through extended martial art practice, in which you realize that just flailing about won't actually bring flexibility and opening to many parts of your body mind. You need the detailed dexterity to get into the minute fascia of opening. And that is what something like this, a deep Neoplatonic endeavor properly does.